Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases registered in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you are watching and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to which places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The air in Adams County, Mississippi, was always thick with something more than just humidity. In the summer of 1850, the scent of magnolias couldn't mask what permeated the grounds of Willow Creek Plantation, a heaviness that seemed to seep into the very soil. This is where our story begins, at a place that no longer exists on modern maps, but whose shadow still darkens the corners of historical records found in dusty courthouse archives. The Willow Creek ledgers should have been like any other plantation accounting book from that era. Lists of cotton bales, equipment purchases, and human beings catalogued as property. But County Clerk Thomas Whitfield noticed something peculiar when the documents from the Boyd estate arrived at the Adams County Courthouse in January of 1869, 4 years after the Civil War had ended. There appears to be inconsistencies in the birth records that require further examination, Whitfield noted in his official correspondence to the district judge. The document, preserved in county archives, would gather dust for nearly a century before historian Margaret Callaway discovered it while researching post-war economic transitions in 1867. What Whitfield had found was a meticulous dual accounting system maintained by Lillian Boyd, wife of plantation owner Nathan Boyd. One ledger tracked standard plantation operations, profits, losses, crop yields. The other, bound in dark leather and kept under lock and key in her private desk, according to servant testimonies, documented something altogether more disturbing. In her private ledger, Lillian had maintained records spanning 15 years of what she called her breeding program. The clinical precision with which she documented her activities suggested a calculating mind that viewed human reproduction as merely another plantation resource to be optimized. What made the case particularly unusual was not that enslaved people were being treated as breeding stock. This was a horrific reality throughout the antebellum South. But that Lillian Boyd had apparently orchestrated an elaborate system involving her husband's own daughters from a previous marriage. The girls have proven adequately persuasive in determining suitable pairings, read one entry from March of 1852. Subject William continues to resist, but Eleanor has demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in securing compliance. County Historical Society records indicate that Nathan Boyd had 3 daughters from his marriage to his first wife, Sarah, who died in childbirth in 1840. Eleanor was the oldest at 21 years of age in 1850, followed by Catherine at 19 and Rebecca at 17. What role these young women played in Lillian's operation remained unclear from the ledgers alone. But testimonies collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents in 1866 from former enslaved people who had worked at Willow Creek painted a disturbing picture. According to a deposition given by former house servant Martha Johnson, aged approximately 53. Miss Lillian, she had those girls doing her bidding. They wasn't allowed to refuse her nothing. And the things she had them do to those poor men, it wasn't natural. Before the peculiar activities at Willow Creek came to light, the plantation had presented a facade of genteel southern prosperity. Nathan Boyd had purchased the property in 1838 after relocating from Virginia with considerable wealth derived from his family's tobacco enterprises. Architectural records preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History describe Willow Creek as a Greek Revival structure of substantial proportions, featuring 6 Doric columns supporting the front portico with detached kitchen and service buildings arranged in a traditional southern plantation layout. The main house stood on a gentle rise overlooking the Mississippi River, visible in the distance through a carefully maintained alley of oak trees. 42 enslaved people lived and worked on the property when Nathan purchased it, a number that would grow to over 100 by 1855, according to tax records. Nathan Boyd was known in Natchez society as a relatively reserved man who preferred managing his plantation affairs to the elaborate social functions that occupied much of planter-class life. His first wife's death had left him with 3 daughters to raise, and local gossip indicated he was an indulgent father who rarely disciplined the girls. When he remarried in 1847, his new bride was Lillian Hartwell, the 32-year-old daughter of a Charleston merchant. She arrived in Mississippi with her own substantial inheritance and a reputation for shrewd business acumen, unusual in a woman of her time and station. Mrs. Boyd was exceedingly precise in all matters, wrote Reverend James Thornwell in his 1870 memoirs of his time serving as a visiting minister to various plantations around Natchez. She maintained ledgers and accounts with such attention to detail that Mr. Boyd was known to joke that she would have made a finer banker than any man in the state. What neighbors and associates noted about Lillian was her particular interest in the enslaved people who worked the plantation. Unlike many planter-class women who preferred to maintain distance from field operations, Lillian regularly visited the quarters and took a direct hand in managing work assignments. She had opinions about who should work where that master himself didn't question, recalled former field hand Samuel Brooks in his Freedmen's Bureau testimony, and she took special interest in the young women who were of childbearing age. Said it was a woman's duty to look after woman's matters. In the carefully maintained social fabric of Adams County, nothing about Willow Creek Plantation appeared outwardly unusual. The Boyds attended St. Mary's Cathedral in Natchez on Sundays. They contributed to community charitable efforts. Nathan served on the local Agricultural Society board, while Lillian organized social functions with appropriate Southern gentility. Yet behind the white columns, and beneath the veneer of civility, something altogether different was occurring. The whispers began among the enslaved community first, then spread to neighboring plantations through secret nighttime meetings and messages passed along the river. Everyone knew something wasn't right at Willow Creek, testified James Harris, who had been enslaved at a neighboring plantation. Folks who got sold there came back changed, if they came back at all. And there was talk about those Boyd girls and what they were made to do. The catalyst for what would eventually be revealed about Willow Creek appeared innocuous at first: the arrival of a physician new to the area in the spring of 1850. Dr. William Mercer had trained at the University of Pennsylvania's medical school and moved south seeking opportunity in the prosperous river counties. Plantation owners routinely engaged doctors to attend to the health of their enslaved workforce, viewing such medical care as protection of valuable property rather than humanitarian concern. Nathan Boyd contracted with Dr. Mercer to make quarterly visits to Willow Creek to examine the enslaved population and address any medical issues that might affect productivity. Dr. Mercer's medical logs, discovered in 1898 by his grandson and donated to the Mississippi Medical Historical Society, provide the first outside documentation of unusual practices at the plantation. I was today asked by Mrs. Boyd to examine 14 women between the ages of 16 and 25 for their suitability for breeding purposes, he wrote in April 1850. She requested specific measurements and assessments of physical condition that go beyond standard examinations. I find the request unusual, but not entirely without precedent, as many planters take interest in the reproductive capabilities of their female slaves. In subsequent entries, Dr. Mercer noted his growing discomfort with Lillian Boyd's requirements. Mrs. Boyd insists I document the menstrual cycles of all women of childbearing age and report to her immediately upon any who appear to have conceived. She maintains her own records which she cross-references with mine. Her knowledge of reproductive biology exceeds what one might expect from a lady of her station. By his July visit, Dr. Mercer's notes reflect increasing unease. Today I was asked to examine 3 men whom Mrs. Boyd has designated as primary breeders. She spoke of them in terms one would use for prized bulls. More disturbing was the presence of Miss Eleanor Boyd during these examinations, taking notes at her stepmother's direction. I find this highly inappropriate for an unmarried young woman of good family. What Dr. Mercer could not have known was that his arrival coincided with the formalization of a system that had been developing since shortly after Lillian's marriage to Nathan. His medical expertise was being co-opted into what court records would later describe as a systematic program of controlled human reproduction designed to produce offspring with specific physical characteristics. Lillian had been fascinated by the emerging scientific theories of heredity and selective breeding that were gaining attention in agricultural circles. Publications like The American Agriculturist and Southern Cultivator regularly featured articles about improving livestock through careful selection of breeding pairs. Lillian appears to have applied this thinking to the human beings she considered property. A letter discovered in 1872, written by Lillian to a cousin in Charleston, hinted at her thinking, "The principles that improve cattle and horses must surely apply to all living creatures. I have embarked on an experiment of considerable potential value, though it is not one I can discuss openly in present company. Nathan knows little of these matters and is content to leave the management of certain aspects of the plantation to my discretion." The experiment would continue for nearly a decade, hidden within the daily operations of a working cotton plantation, its true nature concealed from neighbors, church associates, and even Nathan himself. But the arrival of Dr. Mercer introduced an outside observer whose professional ethics would eventually conflict with what he was witnessing. As Dr. Mercer's visits continued, he began to notice patterns that troubled him professionally and morally. The birth rate among enslaved women at Willow Creek significantly exceeded that of other plantations in his practice. Moreover, Lillian Boyd showed unusual interest in the physical characteristics of newborns, having Dr. Mercer document details like skin tone, muscle development, and skull measurements. When he cautiously raised questions about these practices during his October 1850 visit, Lillian had a ready explanation. Dr. Mercer reports that Mrs. Boyd dismissed my concerns with practiced ease, his journal noted. She claims her interest stems from a desire to ensure healthy children who will thrive and bring credit to the plantation's management. She cited agricultural publications and suggested I acquaint myself with the latest scientific thinking regarding inheritance of traits. Her manner was such that it left little room for further questioning. This pattern of plausible explanations for disturbing realities extended throughout the plantation's operations. When neighboring planters commented on the unusual number of infants and young children at Willow Creek, Nathan would explain that he preferred to raise rather than buy new workers, presenting it as a matter of economic prudence. The Boyd daughters, too, had carefully constructed explanations for their involvement in plantation affairs. Eleanor, the eldest, had developed a reputation in local society as being unusually interested in medical matters. She cultivated an image as a young woman dedicated to caring for the welfare of the plantation's enslaved people, regularly visiting the cabins where new mothers recovered from childbirth. Miss Eleanor presented herself as a ministering angel, recalled Martha Johnson in her testimony. She'd go among the new mothers with gifts of extra food and blankets, speaking softly and making a show of Christian charity. But those women knew. They saw the way she'd examine their babies, making notes in her little book, just like her stepmother taught her. Catherine, the middle daughter, was known for her skill with plantation accounts and often accompanied Lillian when she inspected the fields or visited the quarter where enslaved people lived. her knowledge of which enslaved people had been assigned to which tasks, who had given birth and when, and other details of plantation operations exceeded what might be expected of a planter's daughter. Rebecca, the youngest, had perhaps the most unsettling role, according to testimonies collected after emancipation. Several accounts describe her special responsibility for ensuring that enslaved men selected for Lillian's program cooperated with her requirements. Miss Rebecca had ways of getting compliance, stated James Williams, who had been enslaved at Willow Creek until 1858. She'd threaten men with field punishments if they didn't do as told, but she also offered rewards, extra food, lighter work, protection from being sold away. Some men couldn't resist what was offered, especially the promise not to be sold downriver. Others had no choice at all. For the outside world, neighbors, business associates, church congregation, the Boyd women maintained a facade of typical plantation gentility. Lillian was known as a capable plantation mistress who kept excellent records. The daughters were viewed as well-brought-up young ladies, preparing for eventual marriage and households of their own. Nathan Boyd himself appears to have been, if not entirely ignorant of the full extent of his wife's activities, at least willing to accept her management of what he considered domestic matters without close scrutiny. His own papers and correspondence focus almost exclusively on cotton production, market prices, and plantation improvements. The few references to enslaved people in his writings treat them purely as labor units without acknowledgement of their humanity. Nathan Boyd's willful blindness to his wife's activities represented a common pattern among plantation owners, wrote historian Margaret Calloway in her 1896 analysis. The profitable operation of the plantation was his primary concern, and so long as that continued undisturbed, he had little incentive to question the methods employed. This carefully maintained system of plausible explanations and social performances allowed the unusual practices at Willow Creek to continue unquestioned for years. But beneath the surface, pressures were building that would eventually bring the truth to light. In the years between 1850 and 1855, Willow Creek Plantation developed a peculiar atmosphere, noted by visitors and new arrivals alike. Traveling ministers who stayed overnight reported strange silences that fell over the main house after dark. Business associates who came to negotiate cotton contracts observed tensions between the Boyd daughters that manifested in meaningful glances and abruptly ended conversations when others entered rooms. "There was a heaviness about the place that I cannot adequately describe," wrote cotton factor Charles Maynard in his personal journal after a visit in 1853. "The house is grand enough, the appointment suitable to a family of their standing, yet something essential is absent. It lacks the natural warmth one expects in a household containing 3 young women. They move through their duties like well-rehearsed actresses, saying and doing what is required, but conveying no genuine sentiment. This sense of performance extended to the enslaved community as well. Visitors noted the unusual quiet in the quarter where enslaved families lived, the absence of the songs and stories that typically provided some small measure of cultural resilience under the brutality of the slave system. According to testimonies collected after emancipation, this silence stemmed from the constant scrutiny and intervention of Lillian and her stepdaughters in the most intimate aspects of enslaved people's lives. Couples were formed and separated according to Lillian's program rather than by their own choosing. Children were frequently taken from their mothers and assigned to nursery cabins under the supervision of older women, selected for their compliance with plantation management. "You didn't dare get attached to your baby," testified Sarah Coleman, who had given birth to 3 children while enslaved at Willow Creek. "Miss Lillian would come inspect it like it was a colt or a calf. If she approved of what she saw, that child would be taken to the nursery cabin before it could barely nurse. If she didn't approve, those babies sometimes just disappeared." We were told they'd been sent to another part of the plantation, but nobody ever saw them again. The operation of the plantation nursery was one of Catherine Boyd's primary responsibilities. According to plantation records, by 1855, the nursery housed 32 children between infancy and age 5, an unusually high number even for a plantation of Willow Creek's size. Dr. Mercer's logs show increasing concern about this arrangement. The concentration of so many young children in close quarters presents serious health risks. When I suggested this to Miss Catherine, she informed me that her stepmother considers centralized care more efficient than allowing mothers to keep their infants with them. Efficiency appears to be valued above all other considerations at Willow Creek. For the enslaved adults, Lillian's program created an environment of constant uncertainty and interference. Men selected as breeders were given somewhat privileged positions, better food, less physically demanding work assignments, but remained under intense surveillance and pressure to perform as required. Jacob was one of Miss Lillian's chosen men, recalled Martha Johnson. He got to work in the stables instead of the field, had better clothes, extra rations, but the weight of what they made him do changed him. I watched that man fade away inside himself year by year, until there was nothing left but what they wanted him to be. For enslaved women, the situation was even more oppressive. Those designated as breeding stock in Lillian's ledgers were subject to regular examinations, strict dietary regimens, and controlled pairings. They were expected to produce a child approximately every 2 years, with those who failed to conceive facing potential sale. The psychological impact of this system created the eerie silence that visitors noticed. Normal human relationships became nearly impossible under such surveillance and control. The basic human desires for connection, for choice in intimate matters, for parental bonds with one's children, all were systematically suppressed in service of Lillian's program. Even speech itself became dangerous. Plantation records include multiple instances of punishment for what Lillian termed unsuitable conversation among the enslaved community. Several testimonies mention a woman named Grace who received 20 lashes for telling traditional folk tales to children in the nursery, as Lillian considered these superstitious influences detrimental to her aims. This atmosphere of repression extended to the main house as well. Household servants reported that Nathan and Lillian maintained separate bedrooms and rarely dined alone together. The daughters were kept under close supervision, with Eleanor as Lillian's primary assistant and enforcer over her younger sisters. Miss Eleanor changed the most over the years, testified household servant Esther Williams. When I first came to Willow Creek, she was just a girl, 17 or 18, still grieving her mama. Kind enough in her way, though distant like all white folks are. But after a few years under Miss Lillian's influence, she turned cold. She watched everyone all the time, reporting back anything that might interest her stepmother. The other girls feared her almost as much as they feared Miss Lillian herself. By 1855, this carefully controlled system had produced results that Lillian meticulously documented in her private ledger. The enslaved population had grown to 112, with a disproportionate number of young children and adolescents compared to typical plantation demographics. More disturbing were her notes on specific bloodlines she had established through her controlled pairings, with detailed observations about physical characteristics, intelligence, temperament, and suitability for different types of work. But systems built on such total control of human beings inevitably develop fractures. At Willow Creek, the first significant crack appeared in the summer of 1855, when Dr. Mercer discovered something in the plantation nursery that would ultimately lead him to break his silence. On August 12, 1855, Dr. William Mercer made an unscheduled visit to Willow Creek Plantation. His medical log, written later that evening at his Natchez office, reveals the reason. I was called to the plantation unexpectedly after a message that several children in the nursery had developed high fevers. Upon arrival, I found 5 children between the ages of 2 and 4 years suffering from what appears to be measles. The condition of the nursery was concerning, overcrowded, inadequately ventilated, and lacking basic sanitary provisions despite my previous recommendations. What Mercer encountered next shifted his understanding of Willow Creek's operations. With the regular nursery attendants overwhelmed by caring for the sick children, Catherine Boyd had assigned Rebecca to assist. When Mercer arrived, he found Rebecca engaged in something unexpected. Miss Rebecca was documenting the progression of the illness in each child with remarkable clinical detail. She showed me a ledger in which she had been recording temperature changes, development of rash, respiratory symptoms, and other clinical observations hourly since the illness began. When I expressed surprise at this level of medical monitoring, she explained that her stepmother required such documentation for all illnesses, births, and deaths among the enslaved population. Mercer's professional curiosity led him to request to see these records. Rebecca hesitated, but perhaps seeing an opportunity for medical validation of her work, agreed to show him some of the materials stored in a small office adjacent to the nursery. What Mercer found was far more extensive than he had anticipated. Years of detailed records documenting the controlled breeding program that Lillian had established. The clinical language used to describe human beings shocked even a physician accustomed to the dehumanization inherent in the slave system. Subject 23, Mariah, age 22, successfully bred to Subject 17, Isaac. Resulting offspring, female displays desired characteristics, robust muscular development, estimated birth weight 8 lbs, lighter skin tone. Designated for house training pending continued development. More disturbing were records of unsuccessful breeding attempts and their consequences. Subject 36, Lucy, has failed to conceive after 3 scheduled breeding attempts with Subject 14. Recommend sale at next Natchez market and replacement with younger female with proven fertility. Mercer also discovered documentation of the Boyd daughters' involvement. Eleanor had been trained to conduct physical examinations of both enslaved men and women, assessing their reproductive fitness using criteria developed by Lillian. Catherine managed the inventory of children, tracking their development and assigning them to different training regimens based on Lillian's assessment of their capabilities. Rebecca, the youngest daughter, was responsible for ensuring cooperation from the enslaved men selected for the breeding program. The methods she employed were detailed in a separate journal, written in her own hand, but clearly supervised by Lillian. Today, Subject 19, William, expressed reluctance to participate in scheduled breeding with Subject 42. Applied usual persuasion methods without success, resorted to option 3, as authorized by mother. Subject complied after initial resistance. Will monitor for continuing attitude problems. The clinical language only partially obscured the reality of what option 3 entailed. The records elsewhere referenced physical punishment, food deprivation, and threats of selling family members as escalating options for ensuring compliance. Dr. Mercer left Willow Creek that day deeply troubled by what he had discovered. His medical log shows his ethical struggle. I have today witnessed evidence of practices that exceed even the considerable moral compromises inherent in the institution of slavery. The systematic breeding of human beings as one would livestock, with the forced participation of young women of supposedly good Christian upbringing, represents a descent into barbarism that I cannot in good conscience ignore. Yet what action can I take? The law provides no remedy, as enslaved people are property to be used as their owners see fit. The Church might censure such activities if made aware, but would likely focus on the impropriety of involving the Boyd daughters rather than the fundamental evil being perpetrated. Mercer's dilemma reflected the moral contradictions of Southern society. As a physician practicing in Mississippi, his livelihood depended on maintaining relationships with wealthy planters. Yet his medical training and personal ethics conflicted with what he had witnessed. For 2 weeks, Mercer took no action beyond documenting what he had seen in his private journal. Then, on August 28th, he was called back to Willow Creek for an emergency that would force his hand. The emergency that brought Dr. Mercer back to Willow Creek was reported as a serious accident involving one of the enslaved men. When he arrived, he found Jacob, one of Lillian's primary breeding men, with severe injuries. "The patient has suffered multiple lacerations to his back, consistent with whipping," Mercer wrote in his medical log. More concerning are the unusual burns on his lower abdomen and genitals. When I inquired about the cause of these injuries, I was told by Mrs. Boyd that Jacob had attempted to mutilate himself to avoid his plantation duties. The nature and pattern of the injuries are not consistent with self-infliction. Jacob was unconscious when Mercer arrived, having lost significant blood. As the doctor worked to treat his wounds, he was approached by Martha Johnson, an enslaved woman who served as a house servant. She whispered to me when others were out of earshot that Jacob had been punished for refusing to service a woman as ordered, Mercer recorded. She stated that after multiple refusals, Miss Rebecca had overseen his punishment, which included application of heated metal implements. Martha begged me to help, saying Jacob had declared he would rather die than continue his role in Miss Lillian's breeding stock. This direct testimony from Martha, combined with the clear evidence of torture before his eyes, resolved Mercer's ethical dilemma. He determined to find some way to intervene, though the legal and social constraints remained formidable. Jacob died of his injuries the following day, despite Mercer's efforts. In his official report to Nathan Boyd, Mercer listed the cause as blood loss resulting from self-inflicted injuries, maintaining the plantation's official narrative while he considered his next steps. The death created ripples through the enslaved community at Willow Creek. Though they had lived under Lillian's system for years, Jacob's resistance and subsequent murder represented a breaking point. Whispers began circulating through the quarters at night. Stories passed in hushed tones when overseers weren't present. One story in particular gained momentum, a rumor that Lillian had begun considering breeding some of the young women with Nathan himself to produce offspring that would be blood relatives of the Boyd family, giving her even greater control over the plantation's future. Whether this rumor had any basis in fact remains unclear from surviving records. What is documented is that in September 1855, 3 enslaved people attempted to escape from Willow Creek. Rachel, a 20-year-old woman who had already given birth to 2 children under Lillian's program, David, a 16-year-old boy who worked in the stables, and Sarah, an older woman who had served as a nurse in the plantation nursery. The escape attempt failed. Plantation records clinically document their capture, punishment, and the measures taken to prevent future attempts. Subjects exhibited coordinated escape behavior, suggesting extensive prior communication, applied standard punishment, 25 lashes, to the male. For females, employed alternative correction to avoid damage to reproductive capacity. Older female, subject 8, determined to be instigator based on interrogation. Removed to isolation cabin for intensive correction protocol. What the intensive correction protocol entailed is not specified in Lillian's ledger, but Sarah never reappeared in subsequent plantation records. Rachel was returned to the women's quarter under increased surveillance, and David was sold at the Natchez slave market the following month. These events coincided with Dr. Mercer's careful collection of evidence about Willow Creek's operations. Unable to directly challenge the legality of what was happening, as breeding enslaved people, while morally repugnant, violated no law, he instead focused on documenting the involvement of the Boyd daughters in activities that would be considered deeply inappropriate for young white women of their social standing. By October, Mercer had compiled his observations and evidence into a carefully worded letter, which he sent not to legal authorities, but to Nathan Boyd's older brother, Judge William Boyd, who served on the circuit court in Richmond, Virginia. The letter, preserved in the Boyd family papers at the Virginia Historical Society, was deliberately framed not as a condemnation of slavery itself, but as a concern for the moral welfare of the Boyd daughters. It is with the greatest reluctance that I bring these matters to your attention, knowing the pain they must cause to a man of your standing and Christian principles. However, I cannot in good conscience remain silent about practices at your brother's plantation that threaten not only the souls of those directly involved, but the very moral fabric of our society. Your nieces, young women of gentle breeding and education, have been drawn into activities regarding the enslaved population that no respectable young lady should witness, much less actively participate in. Mercer went on to describe, in carefully chosen language that would not offend 19th-century sensibilities, the breeding program Lillian had established and the roles assigned to each of the daughters. The letter reached Judge Boyd in early November. His response was swift and private. According to entries in Mercer's journal, Judge Boyd arrived in Natchez on November 23rd, accompanied by his wife, ostensibly for a family visit before the Christmas season. What transpired during that visit remains largely undocumented. No correspondence between the brothers survives, and plantation records show only routine entries during this period. What is clear is that by January 1856, significant changes had occurred at Willow Creek. Judge William Boyd's visit to Willow Creek in November 1855 lasted 2 weeks, according to local newspaper social notices. What transpired during those weeks would only gradually become apparent in the months that followed. The first visible change was the departure of Eleanor Boyd. In January 1856, the Natchez Courier announced her engagement to Robert Thornton, the son of a Virginia planter and an associate of her uncle. The wedding took place with unusual haste in Richmond rather than Mississippi, with none of her immediate family in attendance according to the brief social notice. This abrupt removal of Lillian's primary assistant represented the first significant disruption to her system. Eleanor had been instrumental in implementing the breeding program, conducting examinations, keeping records, and supervising her younger sister's participation. Plantation records show subtle but meaningful changes in operations following Eleanor's departure. The detailed tracking of reproductive activities became less consistent. References to specific breeding pairs decreased, replaced by more general documentation of births and plantation population. Dr. Mercer's logs indicate he was permitted to implement some of his previously ignored recommendations regarding the plantation nursery, resulting in improved conditions for the children housed there. His February visit notes found the nursery much improved in cleanliness and ventilation. Number of children reduced by approximately 1/3, with some apparently returned to their mother's care. Miss Catherine explained this as a new approach her father has instructed them to implement. These changes suggest that Judge Boyd's intervention had some effect on plantation operations, likely through pressure applied to Nathan rather than direct confrontation with Lillian. The historical record provides no evidence that Lillian's activities were ever publicly exposed or condemned. The family's social standing remained intact, and no legal actions were taken. However, the system Lillian had built did not simply disappear. It transformed, becoming less documented but perhaps no less controlling. Martha Johnson's testimony suggests the continuance of many practices, just with greater secrecy. After Miss Eleanor left, things got quieter but not really better. Miss Lillian stopped keeping so many papers about what she was doing, but she still watched the young women close, still had her favourites among the men. Miss Catherine took over more of the work, but she wasn't as hard as Miss Eleanor had been. Miss Rebecca, though, she got worse after her sister left, like she had something to prove to her stepmother. The most significant change appeared in Nathan Boyd's level of involvement in plantation management. County records show he began spending more time in Natchez on business, joining several civic committees that required regular meetings. This increased absence from Willow Creek effectively gave Lillian continued freedom to operate, albeit with some new constraints. By 1857, the plantation's enslaved population had grown to 128, maintaining the unusual demographic pattern of numerous children and young adults that characterized Lillian's breeding program. Sales records from this period show fewer enslaved people being sold from Willow Creek than comparable plantations, suggesting Lillian continued to focus on increasing rather than selling her human property. The Boyd house itself took on a strange quality during these years, according to visitors' accounts. The divisions within the family created an atmosphere of constant tension, barely concealed beneath the requirements of social propriety. Catherine and Rebecca continued to live at home, neither marrying despite reaching ages when most young women of their class would have established their own households. Their relationship with their stepmother appeared outwardly correct, but lacking any warmth or genuine connection. "The house never truly sleeps," wrote Reverend Thornwell after a visit in 1858. "At whatever hour I rose during my stay, there was always someone moving about. Mrs. Boyd reviewing accounts in her study well past midnight, Miss Rebecca walking the upstairs hallway before dawn, servants engaged in tasks at unusual hours. The normal rhythms of domestic life seem suspended there, replaced by an unceasing vigilance whose purpose I cannot discern. This vigilance extended to the entire plantation." Multiple sources describe Lillian's habit of making unexpected visits to the enslaved quarters at night, accompanied by Rebecca, inspecting cabins and questioning occupants about their activities. The nursery operated at all hours, with rotating shifts of enslaved women required to care for the children regardless of conventional working times. In March 1858, a fire broke out in one of the storage buildings near the enslaved quarters. While the structure itself was of limited value, the documentation stored inside was not. According to testimony from Samuel Brooks, Lillian had established a secondary record-keeping location outside the main house, accessible only to her and Rebecca. "Miss Lillian didn't trust nobody with them papers," Brooks recalled. "Not even the master himself was allowed to see what she kept in that little office. Miss Rebecca would go there after dark sometimes, carrying a lantern, and stay for hours. Folks said she was writing down everything that happened on the plantation, every birth, every punishment, like she was keeping account for Judgment Day." The fire destroyed these records completely. No investigation into its cause was ever documented, though rumors among the enslaved community suggested it was not accidental. Several testimonies mention a house servant named Thomas, who disappeared the night of the fire, presumably having escaped north. The loss of these secondary records appears to have deeply disturbed Lillian. Plantation operations recorded a 2-week period of disruption as she demanded inventories of all enslaved people, with special attention to pregnant women and children in the nursery. The regular routine of forced breeding was temporarily suspended as she re-established her documentation system. This period coincided with increasing tensions in the broader society. Political debates about slavery's expansion into Western territories dominated national discourse. The Lincoln-Douglas debates occurred that same year, focusing national attention on the fundamental moral questions underlying the peculiar institution that Lillian Boyd had taken to such disturbing extremes. At Willow Creek, these external pressures seemed distant until November 1858, when Dr. Mercer made a discovery that would ultimately lead to the unraveling of what remained of Lillian's system. During his November examination of children in the plantation nursery, Dr. Mercer noticed a young girl of about 3 years who caught his professional attention. As he noted in his medical log, among the children presented for examination today was a female child I had not previously observed. When I inquired, Miss Catherine informed me the child had been kept in the main house due to frequent illness, but had recently been relocated to the nursery. What struck me immediately were certain physical characteristics that seemed strikingly familiar: the shape of the eyes, the distinctive set of the jaw. On closer examination, I observed a small birthmark behind the right ear, identical to one I have noted in treating Miss Rebecca Boyd. Mercer's implication was clear, though unstated. The child bore a strong resemblance to the Boyd family. His suspicion, carefully documented in his private journal rather than his official medical log, was that the girl might be the daughter of Nathan Boyd and one of the enslaved women, a not uncommon situation on southern plantations despite its contradiction of social norms. What Mercer could not have anticipated was the truth revealed to him 2 weeks later by Catherine Boyd during an unexpected visit to his Natchez office. The historical record of this conversation comes from Mercer's detailed journal entry dated December 3rd, 1858. Miss Catherine called upon me today in a state of considerable distress. After ensuring our conversation would remain confidential, she revealed matters so disturbing I hesitate to commit them to paper, yet feel compelled to document them should future events necessitate a record of these revelations. According to Miss Catherine, the child I recently observed, known as Emma, is indeed of Boyd lineage, but not through her father, as I had supposed. Rather, the child's mother is Miss Rebecca Boyd herself. The father, Catherine claims, is one of the enslaved men, Jacob, who died in my care 3 years prior after severe punishment. Catherine states that this relationship was not consensual in any ordinary sense, but rather orchestrated by Mrs. Boyd as part of what Catherine described as an experiment in lineage. Mrs. Boyd apparently developed the idea that controlled breeding between her stepdaughters and selected enslaved men might produce children with desirable characteristics, while maintaining family control over the plantation's future population. Catherine claims she herself was pressured to participate in similar arrangements, but resisted, resulting in her reduced status within the household. Her elder sister, Eleanor, was removed from the plantation after threatening to expose the situation to their uncle, while Rebecca, the youngest and most influenced by her stepmother, eventually capitulated to these demands. The child, Emma, has been presented to visitors as an orphaned daughter of an enslaved woman who died in childbirth, now cared for out of Christian charity. In reality, Catherine claims Rebecca was kept isolated during her pregnancy, with her condition explained to the few who noticed as a prolonged illness requiring confinement. I find these claims almost too horrific to credit, yet Catherine's evident distress and the physical resemblance I myself observed lend them credibility. She has approached me now because Mrs. Boyd has allegedly begun suggesting similar arrangements for other young enslaved women of mixed race who share Boyd family features, the unacknowledged daughters of Nathan Boyd, creating what Catherine called generations of planned lineage under Mrs. Boyd's control. This revelation presented Mercer with an even more profound ethical dilemma than his previous discoveries. The abuse of enslaved people, while morally reprehensible, was sanctioned by law and social custom. But what Catherine described, the sexual exploitation of white women of good family, even if orchestrated rather than directly forced, violated the most sacred boundaries of Southern society. Mercer's journal records his struggle to determine an appropriate course of action. Direct legal intervention seemed impossible. The accusations were too shocking to be made public, and Catherine herself was unwilling to testify formally, fearing the complete destruction of her family's reputation and her own future prospects. In January 1859, Mercer made the decision to once again contact Judge William Boyd, this time with much more explicit information about what was occurring at his brother's plantation. No copy of this letter survives, but its general contents can be inferred from subsequent events. Judge Boyd arrived in Mississippi in February, this time without prior announcement or social pretense. County records indicate he stayed not with his brother, but at the Natchez Hotel. His visit to Willow Creek lasted only one day, but its impact was immediate and significant. Within a week, Rebecca Boyd was sent to a private sanitarium in Virginia, ostensibly for treatment of nervous exhaustion, a common diagnosis for women whose behavior or conditions could not be publicly acknowledged. She would never return to Mississippi. More surprisingly, Nathan Boyd announced his intention to sell Willow Creek and relocate to Tennessee, where he had apparently purchased property sight unseen. The plantation and a portion of the enslaved population were sold in March to James Thornton, a cotton factor from New Orleans. Most revealing was the fate of the child Emma and approximately 15 other young children from the plantation nursery. They disappeared from plantation records completely, with no documentation of sale or transfer. According to Martha Johnson's later testimony, these children, many of whom shared physical characteristics with the Boyd family, were taken north by Judge Boyd's wife, ostensibly to be placed in the care of charitable associations in Pennsylvania. Lillian Boyd herself remained in Mississippi, not accompanying her husband to Tennessee, but instead taking up residence in a small house in Natchez owned by her family. The dramatic reduction in her circumstances suggests that whatever arrangement Judge Boyd negotiated with his brother included significant financial penalties for Lillian. Catherine Boyd also remained in Natchez, eventually marrying a local physician in 1861 and maintaining a position of social respectability, though somewhat diminished from her previous status as a wealthy planter's daughter. The full truth of what happened at Willow Creek might never have become public knowledge had it not been for the outbreak of the Civil War and the subsequent investigations of the Freedmen's Bureau into conditions of enslaved people on former plantations. The confrontation that dismantled Willow Creek's operations occurred largely away from public view, leaving few official records. What can be pieced together comes primarily from personal journals, private correspondence, and later testimonies. Judge William Boyd's approach appears to have been calculated to eliminate the immediate harm while protecting the family name from scandal. His legal training and social standing enabled him to orchestrate a resolution that addressed the core issues without public exposure. His meeting with Nathan Boyd on February 12, 1859, is described briefly in Dr. Mercer's journal based on information Catherine later shared. According to Miss Catherine, her uncle presented her father with evidence of Mrs. Boyd's activities that could not be ignored or explained away. This included not only details about Rebecca's child, but documentation of other instances where Mrs. Boyd had used her position to orchestrate similar arrangements. Catherine believes her uncle threatened to expose the situation to church authorities and the broader community if immediate action was not taken. The most detailed account of this confrontation comes from a letter written by Judge Boyd to his wife after his return to Virginia, discovered among family papers in 1922. The matter has been addressed as thoroughly as circumstances allow. Nathan was genuinely shocked by some of what I revealed, though I suspect he had long chosen not to examine too closely the management practices his wife implemented. His initial impulse was toward disbelief, but the evidence I presented, particularly regarding Rebecca's condition, left no room for denial. Mrs. Boyd herself received my accusations with remarkable composure. She attempted first to portray her actions as motivated by scientific interest rather than moral corruption, referencing agricultural breeding practices as if human beings were no different from livestock. When this approach failed to move me, she transitioned to thinly veiled threats about the consequences to family reputation should these matters become public. It was only when I made clear that my primary concern was for Rebecca and the other girls, and that I was prepared to sacrifice reputation for their welfare, that she recognized her position was untenable. The terms I outlined were non-negotiable. Rebecca to be removed immediately to Virginia, where we can ensure proper care. Nathan to dissolve his connection with the plantation, and provisions made for the children who share our family's blood, however shameful the connection. Mrs. Boyd's sole victory, if it can be called such, was securing a modest income for herself, separate from Nathan's affairs. I granted this not from any sympathy for her position, but from practical necessity, as her complete destitution would likely lead to desperate actions that might yet bring these matters to public attention. I pray this resolution, imperfect as it is, will allow healing to begin. Rebecca's condition is concerning. She appears to have accepted her stepmother's worldview to a degree that suggests profound manipulation over many years. The physician I have consulted believes removal from that influence is the essential first step toward recovery, though he cautions the process may be lengthy and incomplete. The confrontation, while private, sent ripples through Natchez society. The sudden sale of a prosperous plantation, the abrupt departure of family members, and the unexplained reduction in Lillian Boyd's circumstances generated inevitable gossip. However, the specific nature of the situation appears to have remained largely concealed, with most speculation focusing on financial mismanagement or marital discord rather than the disturbing truth. For the enslaved people of Willow Creek, the change in ownership brought significant disruption but little immediate improvement in conditions. James Thornton, the new owner, operated the plantation as a purely commercial venture, with little of Lillian's pseudo-scientific interest in controlled breeding, but the fundamental brutality of slavery remained unchanged. Dr. Mercer continued to serve as plantation physician under the new ownership, using his position to document conditions and provide what limited assistance he could until the outbreak of war in 1861 disrupted all normal operations. The most profound confrontation between Southern society and the moral bankruptcy of the system it had created would come not through private family intervention, but through the national cataclysm of civil war. The Civil War reached Adams County in 1863, when Union forces captured Natchez after the fall of Vicksburg. Federal troops occupied the city, while Confederate guerrillas continued to operate in surrounding rural areas, creating a precarious situation for plantations like the former Willow Creek. James Thornton, like many plantation owners, fled before the advancing Union forces, leaving his property under the management of an overseer. According to testimonies collected by Freedmen's Bureau agents in 1865, many enslaved people seized the opportunity presented by this disruption to claim their freedom, either fleeing to Union lines or simply asserting their liberty by refusing to continue plantation labor without compensation. Martha Johnson, who had witnessed the worst of Lillian Boyd's regime, described the moment. When word came that the Yankees had taken Natchez, it went through the quarters like lightning. Some folks left that very night, heading for town. Others stayed, waiting to see what would happen. The overseer tried to keep things going like before, but everyone knew it was over. We might not have been legally free yet, but in our minds we were done being property. The formal end of slavery would not come until the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in January 1863 in Union-controlled territories, and not until the 13th Amendment in 1865 for the nation as a whole. But the war's progression effectively dismantled the institution in areas under federal control well before these legal milestones. For Lillian Boyd, the war brought financial ruin and social isolation. The modest income secured for her in the 1859 agreement depended on plantation revenues that vanished as the conflict disrupted cotton production and markets. Property records show she sold her Natchez house in 1864, with no documentation of where she relocated afterward. One intriguing document from this period suggests a final confrontation between Lillian and those she had victimized. A report filed by a Union Army lieutenant in August 1864 describes an incident at a small house outside Natchez. Responded to reports of disturbance at residence of Mrs. L. Boyd, formerly of Willow Creek Plantation, found approximately 15 formerly enslaved persons, primarily women, confronting Mrs. Boyd regarding past treatment. Situation tense but not violent upon our arrival. Leaders of the group, identified as Martha Johnson and Samuel Brooks, presented articulate grievances regarding specific abuses under Mrs. Boyd's management, particularly concerning forced breeding practices and separation of families. Mrs. Boyd refused to acknowledge these accusations and demanded military protection from what she termed an insurrection. After interviewing all parties, determined no immediate threat of violence existed, but ordered the group to disperse to prevent escalation. Mrs. Boyd was advised to relocate as her continued presence near former plantation lands may lead to further confrontations. Most concerning were specific allegations regarding Mrs. Boyd's treatment of her stepdaughters and certain children of mixed parentage, claims so disturbing as to be almost beyond credibility, yet presented with such consistency and detail as to merit further investigation. No record exists of any formal investigation following this report. The chaotic conditions of wartime Mississippi, with military occupation, refugee movements, and the breakdown of civil institutions, made systematic examination of past abuses nearly impossible. The confrontation described in the lieutenant's report represents both closure and its absence. The formerly enslaved people had gained the freedom to directly confront their oppressor, yet the justice they sought remained elusive. The system that had enabled Lillian's actions was crumbling, but personal accountability for specific abuses largely escaped her. Nathan Boyd remained in Tennessee throughout the war, his plantation there considerably smaller than Willow Creek had been. Records indicate he died in 1867, leaving a modest estate divided between Catherine and Eleanor. No provision was made for Rebecca, suggesting she may have predeceased him or remained institutionalized. The most complete form of closure, or revenge depending on one's perspective, came through the fundamental transformation of the society that had enabled Willow Creek's horrors. The end of slavery, while not immediately delivering equality or justice, created the possibility for formerly enslaved people to establish families free from the kinds of intervention Lillian had practiced. Martha Johnson's final testimony to Freedmen's Bureau agents in 1866 expressed this bittersweet reality. Miss Lillian lost everything she valued: her position, her control over others, her scientific pretensions. But that don't undo what she did to so many. Those children bred for sale, the families broken apart, the young women used like cattle. Justice would mean accounting for each of those wrongs individually. We ain't likely to see that kind of justice in this world. But we're free now. My grandson will grow up never knowing the feeling of being somebody's property. That's something Miss Lillian couldn't prevent, for all her planning and controlling. In 1869, 4 years after the Civil War's conclusion, County Clerk Thomas Whitfield's discovery of Lillian Boyd's ledgers among estate papers submitted for probate created the official record that would eventually bring Willow Creek's history to light. His brief notation about inconsistencies in the birth records would lie dormant in courthouse archives for nearly a century. The plantation itself continued operating under various owners, transitioning from slave labor to tenant farming after emancipation. The grand house that had witnessed so much suffering was destroyed by fire in 1878. Whether by accident or intentional act remains undocumented. By the early 20th century, the name Willow Creek had disappeared from local usage, the property subdivided, and the original plantation boundaries obscured by new development. The physical evidence of what had occurred there vanished into overgrown fields and second-growth forest. The Boyd family story similarly faded from public memory. Catherine lived until 1904, maintaining a respectable but quiet position in Natchez society. Her children and grandchildren apparently never learned the full truth about Willow Creek, as family correspondence from later generations expresses curiosity about why certain aspects of their history remained unmentioned in family narratives. Eleanor remained in Virginia after her hasty marriage, having 3 children and living until 1891. Her husband's political career included service in the Virginia legislature, suggesting the Boyd family connections retained some influence despite the financial reversals of the war years. Rebecca's fate is the most obscure. No death certificate or burial record has been found, and sanitarium records from the period are incomplete. The most likely explanation is that she remained institutionalized until her death, her story subsumed into the broader tragedy of 19th-century mental health treatment. The most enduring echo of Willow Creek's history emerged not through official documentation, but through the oral traditions preserved by formerly enslaved families. Stories about Miss Lillian's breeding farm circulated in African-American communities in Adams County well into the 20th century, maintaining the memory of these events even as mainstream historical accounts overlooked them. Historian Margaret Callaway's discovery of Thomas Whitfield's notation in 1967 led her to search for additional documentation, eventually uncovering Dr. Mercer's medical logs in the archives of the Mississippi Medical Historical Society and portions of Lillian's ledgers preserved in county probate records. Callaway's 1869 monograph, Scientific Slavery, the breeding program at Willow Creek Plantation, represented the first scholarly examination of these events. Her work faced significant resistance from some quarters, with critics questioning both her methodology and her motives in examining such disturbing aspects of the past. Perhaps the most telling response came from a descendant of Catherine Boyd, who wrote to Callaway after the monograph's publication, "While I cannot dispute the documentary evidence you have presented, I must question the purpose served by exposing these painful matters after so many years. My great-grandmother Catherine, by all accounts a woman of exemplary character, evidently chose to shield her descendants from knowledge of these events. Should we not respect her judgment in this matter, rather than disturbing the rest of those long dead?" Callaway's response, preserved in her papers at the University of Mississippi, addressed the broader significance of recovering such difficult history. The horrors that occurred at Willow Creek were not anomalies, but rather the logical extension of a system that denied the humanity of enslaved people. By reducing human beings to property, slavery created conditions where individuals like Lillian Boyd could implement their disturbing visions without legal or social constraint. If we shrink from examining the most extreme manifestations of this system, we cannot fully understand its fundamental immorality or the courage of those who survived it. Moreover, the stories of Martha Johnson, Samuel Brooks, and others who endured these conditions deserve to be known. Their testimonies, preserved in Freedmen's Bureau records, reveal not just suffering, but remarkable resilience and humanity maintained under the most dehumanizing circumstances. To suppress their stories out of concern for the reputation of those who oppress them would be to perpetuate the very system of silencing that enabled the original abuses. In the decades since Calloway's work, archaeological excavations at the former Willow Creek site have uncovered physical evidence supporting the documentary record. The foundations of the unusually large nursery building, medical implements consistent with Dr. Mercer's descriptions of examinations performed there, and the remains of the small office building that burned in 1858, with fragments of paper and ledger bindings still preserved in the ash layer. The sound that still echoes from Willow Creek is not just the horror of what occurred there, but the persistence of memory against forces of erasure. Martha Johnson's testimony, Samuel Brooks's recollections, Dr. Mercer's troubled conscience, these voices reached across decades of silence to ensure that what happened would not be entirely forgotten. For modern visitors to Adams County, no historical marker identifies the former Willow Creek location. The land is now part of private farms, with little visible evidence of its past. Yet in archives, in family stories, and in the ongoing work of historians committed to uncovering difficult truths, the echoes persist. Perhaps the most appropriate memorial to those who suffered under Lillian Boyd's regime comes not from official recognition, but from the descendants of those who endured. In 2012, researchers from the Adams County Oral History Project interviewed Marie Williams, the great-granddaughter of Martha Johnson. Her reflection provides a fitting conclusion to this dark chapter of Mississippi history. My great-grandmother made sure this story stayed alive in our family. Not to keep hatred burning, she was clear about that. She didn't want us carrying that weight. She wanted us to know because it was part of what made us who we are, not just the suffering, but the survival. People lived through Willow Creek and went on to build lives and families in freedom. That's not just history, that's triumph. The triumph remains incomplete, the echoes unresolved. But in breaking the silence that once surrounded places like Willow Creek, we move incrementally toward the full reckoning that justice demands.